right, it is 6:05, so I'm going to get started. Welcome, everybody. Today, I'm going to go over I called it do's and don'ts for concepting for 3D, but honestly, none of these are super hard rules. This is mostly just a collection of my experience, as well as some of my friends' experiences, just working with concepts and adapting those to 3D. So, yeah, don't take anything I'm saying as like hard gospel truth, but this is mostly just things hopefully you guys will think about going forward. But yeah, the main thing I'm going to talk about is communication. For the most part, 3D, I mean, you can model just about anything, but knowing how it's going to be used and how it's going to be implemented and who you're working with is really important. So, yeah, a lot of this is really going to come down to how much time you have and what your end goal is. So, I mean, in a big studio, this sort of thing might not even be your problem, but we're still in school, and especially if you're going to be starting capstones next year, how the concept gets made is still going to kind of be a bit on your shoulders, and you probably will have a hand in that production. So it's good to just keep in mind these sort of the intricacies of taking something 2D and giving it a 3D form. So here's some things you should have in mind typically. Basically, expectations for what your artist is going to deliver, so level of detail, style, and a lot of these kind of do tie back just into traditional things that you're probably used to with concept art. But if you take something like a game, for instance, the level of detail might vary. If it's something where you're not really going to see the character's face close up, it's always going to be in third person, maybe that's something you don't really have to worry about too much. But it's going to change case by case, especially if it's a capstone. Chances are, camera might get pretty close to your character. So just knowing that sort of thing. Also, know how much creative freedom you want to give to your tech team, because if you don't draw it, they're going to have to kind of come up with it. So that's just something to keep in mind. Next, just sort of the function of whatever you're making. This is more like the tech side. What kind of topology do you need? Is it going to be simmed? What sort of resolution, Are these concepts you're making for background things? Or are these going to be 2 inches away from the camera and you're going to see every crevice? So just sort of the more functional aspect. And then timeline. How much time do you have for these sort of things? You can design as much as you want, but certain things are going to take longer to model, to rig, to animate. So just sort of knowing your limits, whether it's a capstone and you have a whole year plus maybe even a summer versus a 10-week collaboration, which is going to be a bit tighter. In addition to this, also thinking about who you're working with and the different roles. I know you can never know entirely what somebody else's job does, but just knowing the basics of what each person's going to need to get their step done. And in my experience, usually the person before the next step just kind of looks out for the person who's going to come after them and then work with what they've made. But also just bridging the gap between like the first person to touch it and the last person to touch it is going to still help in the long run, because again, not everybody can keep track of everything. And so just talking to each other. For example, like modelers, I'm going to talk about each of these sort of aspects of each person's job, but just making sure you give everybody what they need and have the conversations and give them the knowledge they need to know. So yeah, I'm not going to go through each of these right now because I'm going to go through them as I talk. But to start off, I want to talk about modelers. Basically, always assume your modeler isn't going to know, because there isn't really a way for them to know unless you tell them. So making sure you really, stick with the basics. Like, if you don't show something from another view, they're not going to be able to read your mind. And so I know this is a really simple example, but just sort of keep in mind how quickly something can get lost in translation. And so even if you have like your nice rendered turnaround, but you just need one little sketch off to the side to show how something else in the concept looks, it's worth doing, because, we have to communicate. But yeah, so just different angles. If you are going to need it, you're going to have to show it, because some things you can't just show through different angles. So also keep in mind what you might not see from a side view, but you might see from a lower angle or a back angle. So just kind of sometimes a little like an X-ray also I found super helpful. These are just things I've done for myself personally. Obviously, I didn't model the bear skull in like the final render, but having that there helped me place the teeth correctly, everything lined up. And then I also knew going forwards when I handed this off to Nico, our rigger, I knew that it could work and function how he would need it to. So just sort of showing these things, even if they're not gonna necessarily be seen in a turnaround, making sure they're there and that the information is there. Also, when you get to, this is a bit muddier, but once you get into like some more stylized and cartoony characters, sometimes the base form of your model isn't going to have everything you want to have, if that makes sense. And this is actually sort of a loose case study of another situation I was aware of where the team made a concept, it looked good, everything got approved, it got past the modeler made it, everything looked good, and then it got to the animator and the director was like, hey, can you make this thing blink? And the animator was like, with what eyelids? So basically, if your character is going to have certain expressions, try and think about those ahead of time if it's more cartoony and stylistic, because you need to make sure that the people at the end of the pipeline have everything they need. And yeah, if you don't make it, it's not going to be there. Also, always assume if you put anything you include also though will be used. For example, on another project I was on, I was told the mouth of a frog didn't matter, and then eventually, so I didn't texture it, but because I made the mouth of the frog, the animators did use it. And so this kind of works both ways, as if you need it, make sure you include it, and if you include it, make sure you finish it, because even if you're told it's not going to matter, if it's there, it's going to get used. But yeah, also, just a quick thing, if you're wanting to show these other like smaller details, but you don't have time to fully flesh it out and draw it, you can also use callouts. So if you look at my diver character and you look at the shoes, they're pretty bare minimum. They're basically just blocks of color. I really did not have time to fully flesh those out. So to kind of balance that out, I just went online, I just found some pictures of some diver boots. And that's what I used to reference when I was modeling. And then with this dragon, I just didn't have time to really fully render what kind of fabrics it was going to be. So again, just went on Google Images, snatched those up, and then when it came time to texture, I had basically all the information I needed to know. So just knowing when it's necessary to draw and to render, but then also just sometimes cutting corners. And this ultimately isn't going to be as pretty as something you might see in like one of the concept of type books, but really the key to, or the most important thing about concept at the end of the day is communication. So just knowing whatever you need and giving as much as you can is going to make a big difference. Also, when it comes to posing your characters for your modelers, trying to stick with a good A pose for your concept is really helpful. Because as much as we can see just like one-to-one how you would like something to look, that's really best case scenario because it just leaves less to be interpreted. And so just kind of trying your best to foresee what the rigger is going to want. Having a conversation with your rigger also is really important because some of them have different preferences. Some people prefer to have the mouth slightly open. Some people prefer to have the arms slightly up. It's really going to be, person to person. But at the end of the day, if you can, just having your turnaround in some sort of A pose, very neutral, it's a big help. Also just having, again, like little call outs to props, really big. This actually is a fantastic example. Honestly, like, if I had to go model a character and I knew nothing of it, this is like the gold standard of what I would hope someone would give me. So big shout out to Pia, because we have, the plain turnaround, A pose, very neutral, then to the side, we have a good rendered version, so if I moved on to the texturing stage, I would kind of know what we're going for there. Additionally, we have some expressions, so I can kind of see, okay, what does the mouth look like? What should I be going for with teeth, eyes, all that. Also, we have some good action poses, which I'll get into that more later, but having action poses and just like even simple sketches is really huge because the animators and the riggers kind of need to know what your model is going to be capable of, and this will also help them sort of tell the modelers at least what sort of topology they might need. So for something pretty standard like this guy, he looks pretty normal anatomy. I'd imagine his movements wouldn't be too cartoony, but if he was going to have some more cartoony movements, that might impact how his rig would be set up and what sort of controls would be added for him. So this, honestly, 100, like, perfect. But yeah, and it doesn't have to be that, like, it can be simpler too. Like, this was that frog I mentioned where I made the mouth that I did not texture. But honestly, like, this, also 10 out of 10. I have everything I need. I have the model, and then, well, basically on the left was the original concept made by Josh, our director. And then he went and he had a conversation with Nico, our rigger, and together they came up with this other turnaround that I was able to use. And this was super helpful because I knew that I was giving Nico what he needed, and I also knew that it was fulfilling what the directors wanted stylistically. And so just making sure that you have all these people talking is really going to just make sure that you don't have to backtrack and then, like, move things around and just cost time. Also, though, I'd say my only note with this concept is look out for, I just call them drawing lies. Sometimes, and it'll just be really subtle things. So, like, this honestly was not a big deal. All it was I went on Discord and I said, hey, which of these is it supposed to look like? It just looks different from different angles. And then I got an answer. So this is super small, but just, like, kind of pay attention to things that you imply from one angle that don't necessarily translate to the other angle. But again, this was super minor, but it's just something to look out for. Also, quick side note, because it kind of builds off of that, of just, like, sort of cheating and lying about angles. I'm really not a fan of AI turnarounds. I know in this crowd that's, like, a super, like, lukewarm take. But in, like, sort of the tech area, especially if you're planning on taking one of Parrish's class, he does allow people to use AI concepts, and, like, a fair amount of people do take him up on this. The thing that really kills me, though, is these turnarounds are not consistent most of the time. Maybe it's just because nobody's really spending money for the really good AIs, I don't know, but they always have, like, I'd say, like, these 4 issues drive me insane. Items will face, like, the same direction, whether you're, like, facing front or back. Dimensions will not translate. For example, there was this one time the model had this, or the concept had this really big dress, and the character's hands were in front of the dress in every angle, and I'm like, that just physically does not work. So anyways, artifacts and just, like, gargle, I don't know if that's how you spell gargle, but just, like, you know, stuff that doesn't make sense. Also, this is just what I've noticed, these AI turnarounds always have tons of detail, and the modelers always struggle to make all of the things by the end of the 10-week period. So honestly, if you don't have the time to draw the concept yourself, you probably are going to have a tough time modeling. So just keep that in mind. Again, it's allowed for the class, and so if you are a technical artist and you don't have the means to do a concept, please at least do a draw over. Okay, I'll stop with that now. But anyways, so now that I've gotten that out. So tweaking models in the concept stage is 100% fine. Like, I really enjoy working with, like, some of the biz dev for this bear. And I really wanted to, like, sort of partake in that. I think this stage, like, the early blockout, is, like, peak 3D collaboration time. I'd say, though, beyond, like, blockouts, though, if you're, like, sort of just asking your modeler over and over again to try different things, it gets old kind of fast. And, you know, just keep in mind that your technical artist usually is not your concept artist, that's you. So just try to be really confident with your concepts, and if you're not sure about something, just maybe spend a little bit more time on it, because a draw over can be, like, it can take a little bit of time, but chances are it's going to be a little less time than a full remodel. So just keep that in mind, you know, for everybody's, you know, sanity. And also, okay, so moving on to riggers, just because you can make it doesn't mean it's always going to work. Again, you can kind of model just about anything, with, like, some caveats, but when it comes to rigging, things actually have to work, and so that's sort of why it's important to incorporate them in this concept process, and just having them in the conversation and making sure that they see what you're making. Especially when it comes to hard surface things, you really have to think about movements. Like, this mech, you know, it's a big robot, so you might think, oh, what would that have to do with anatomy? But if you really look at it, you kind of notice, oh, it has a hip ball joint, it has a knee joint, it has an ankle joint. Like, these are really important things that animators are going to need to actually make it move. And so if you model this robot, but you don't think about the different joints it's going to need to walk and grab things, then once the rigger gets it, they're going to be like, well, what am I going to do with this? So really just make sure you're using look for some good real life references. Toys are honestly great for just like understanding the basics of how a mech is gonna move, especially with like the overflow of just like AI and just like a lot of really complicated mech stuff you can find that don't really always make sense. Kind of finding like a simple place to start, I've found pretty helpful. And then with armor, there's so many YouTube videos of hobbyists that just like show you their armor and like take it apart, put it on, show it bend. And so if you like really just need to see how one specific piece works, chances are you can find that on YouTube. But yeah, just be careful of only looking at like sort of fantasy and like other concepts, because like they can look awesome, but sometimes they're really just meant to look awesome. Also, please no metal souls. That's like I don't see it that much, but every time I see it, I get a little bit of like psychic damage because that's never gonna bend. Please don't do metal souls. And just yeah, again, like keep in mind, just think about what it's gonna need to do. So like this concept in the middle, it's awesome, it's really good, but if your character is gonna be running and jumping and like sit down at all, you might have some trouble like rigging that and making sure all the pieces can move together. And then with the arm mobility, same. If you look at like the elbows in that one, it kind of looks like an Iron Man suit, which just all the pieces kind of fit together snug, and you kind of need to bend your arms. So just looking at things like that. And then the guy on the bottom, I actually included just to sort of make another point that if this guy was meant to move around like a normal person, you might run into issues. But if you kind of are planning ahead, you think, oh, I want to make this really armored guy, and I want him to maybe instead of running around, he just rolls around. And now all of a sudden, the fact that his arms may not be super anatomical doesn't really matter anymore. And so I think if I got this concept, I would, go run it by the animators and the riggers and say, hey, does this look like you guys will be able to work with it? And if they're like, yeah, this looks good to go, then that's as much as I'm going to do. But just like kind of, if you see something, just maybe poke around and make sure it's not going to be an issue later. And also, moving on to more organic things, you still kind of have to think about like joint placements and how things are really going to work. I haven't seen Bambi, so I'm sorry if I drew him bad. I just couldn't find a turnaround of him. But I just wanted to kind of show how, it's not super obvious where all of his bones would be, because he's pretty round, he's pretty organic. But basically, this is like a good kind of stage to sort of show your animators what you're hoping to achieve. Like we have plenty of different like action poses and like key poses, and so that way you can kind of make sure you have all the controls necessary. Maybe you really want his head to be able to squash and stretch, so that's something the rigger would need to know, and make sure that your tech artists like know to kind of account for. And then so just kind of combining what you want with how things actually work in real life, and that can usually get you to about what you need. Also, another thing on joints is, if you can, obviously the character's design is usually going to be like number one priority, but if you're designing things like background characters or characters that don't really need to have all like this crazy accessories, avoiding joints is just a good way to kind of cut down on some time and headaches. I kind of just did this little example of some bandages around like the elbow and the wrist. Basically, if you have anything that's overlapping, you're going to want the geometry to be the same so that when it deforms, they deform kind of like in line with each other. But if you have some bandages and it's all different straps wrapped around the elbow, can this be done? Yes, absolutely. But if it's just some throwaway character who's just injured or has some burns, just sliding these kind of things down and just kind of keeping that in mind, that it will be more difficult for somebody in the future. Just if you can, just small things like this save lives. And sort of just more on that. Again, this is more just keeping in mind everybody's like time, really. Because for this example, I just sort of asked one of my friends who basically did a bunch of rigging for capstones, what are like the things that cause you the most issues and headaches, just to avoid if they're not necessary. And basically he just drew me basically a pirate, so I just redrew that pirate, and that's what we have here. So I'm just going to break this down a little bit, just to kind of show what sort of thing they're thinking about, so you kind of know. For example, starting with the eye patch. Cool accessory, but it will have its own asymmetrical weight painting. If you have any sort of face deformers, that's also going to have to be accounted for. Then moving down to the earrings. Now those are going to have secondary motion, so they do have to follow the head, but they also need their own controls. And same goes for the necklaces, any sort of straps, the coat, really cool, but unlike the clothing and the pants that are more tight against the body, you are going to see the internal surfaces. Now, if you're going to simulate things, you will need like the internal body and surfaces of the other clothing, but if this is just being weight painted and rigged, you can delete a lot of internal faces and not have to worry about clipping, except for the coat, because you can still see inside. So that's just another thing of making sure they'll just have to deal with weight painting. Also, because the topology of the outer coat isn't going to line up super well with the internal arm, that's just another little thing. Down to the leg, now, because it's got the peg foot rather than the regular foot, it's going to have one less joint. The joints can't be mirrored. It's going to have a different pivot. Also, typically, a rigger will weight paint everything and just mirror it over, and so everything that's asymmetrical will need its own weight painting. So again, is any of this illegal or wrong? Absolutely not. Again, if you're like in a class with Professor Parrish, he's going to encourage you to make asymmetrical characters because asymmetrical characters are awesome. And especially if all it has to do is spin around and look pretty on a turntable, great, absolutely do it. But if you're designing, some background characters for your world or your capstone, and you have one rigger on your team and there's like 10 characters they got to get through, maybe just save these sort of things for your main character. Now to the animators. So I've kind of touched on this so far, but knowing how it's going to move and making sure you're giving them all the tools they need will prevent any backtracking you might have to do. This is a concept for the game Patch by Joshua, same guy who did like the frog. Great artist, amazing concept. And it definitely, they were going for sort of like a gorilla type robot, and it nails that. But they did run into an issue later on where the animators realized they needed like one more joint in the wrist area, and they didn't have that, so they kind of had to backtrack a bit. And so, just a good way to avoid these is sort of having those 2D animation tests or expression sheets. And these 2D animation tests can also be like offloaded to other animators. Even like 3D animators, at least in my experience, are usually willing to do some sort of 2D test for you. I mean, huge caveat there, like not all of them, but having just somebody sort of plan ahead, can be big. But what can this look like? So for me, in my capstone, yay, this is me in a nutshell. And these were just some earlier like sketches and just like sort of like playing around with what he's gonna do and move around and how he'll look. And so he's definitely very cartoony. His arms are very squat. But as you can see, his arms do kind of move around a lot. And so we needed him to, stay very small and squishy, but we also needed him to have like a decent amount of flexibility. And so we had to kind of figure out, okay, are we going to just make the arms have like extra topology so they can stretch? Or are we going to do something different? And we did do something different. What we ended up doing was basically shrink wrapping his arms and legs to his body. So they're actually separate geometry that can move all around him, but then they also have the bones inside. And so that was just, again, between the animators and the riggers finding a solution. But if that conversation hadn't happened and Sophie had just been given, a picture of me, she probably would have just modeled him with everything together, and then we would have had to go back, and then we would have had to change things and change UVs and all kinds of stuff. So again, just having everybody involved throughout the process. And this can I just wanted to include this short video because this is sort of like a version of the solution we used with me, but like on steroids. Of basically, they had this character that was super cartoony, was going to look different from other angles, needed to be super flexible. And yeah, they just kind of, I'll show that real fast. But, oh wait, is this gonna, okay, good. Yay, okay. I promise it'll get to the rig. Give it like 2 more seconds. was basically most of what I wanted to show with that. Just to kind of show that you can have like a really cool idea, and chances are your animators and like team will figure it out, and they probably can figure it out. But it just needs to be a conversation. They just need to know what the end goal is, and if you just draw a really cool concept, but then you just kind of step out and leave, you know, it'll not always work out super well. But yeah, that was basically what I had to go over. So if anybody has questions about anything I said that I just like breezed through and should go back over or answer, I'll pull up the Discord chat if there's anything there. Hopefully that made sense. Yeah. Any thoughts? Oh, was there? Oh, sorry. Yeah. I didn't see you.
I did want to know, like, how would environments, like, tie into this at all?
Okay, yeah. Yeah. I guess. So, with me in a nutshell, I'm just gonna pull that because that's just my most recent, like, big collaborative project. We kind of didn't really super know about our, like, we kind of just made it up as we went along, which I know is not super fantastic. But I will say that our directors were really good about when we needed something, they were willing to just get it to us really fast. So, for example, the rocks, we were just like, well, what are we going to do for rocks? So they just cranked out some rock ideas. And then when it came to texturing, I asked them, I just like, we kind of ended up breaking it down to we had like shape concepts, and then we also had like texture concepts, because a lot of their illustrations and concepts were very like 2D kind of storybook, but we also needed to translate that to 3D. So just getting as much material as we could, whether it was just like shapes, textures, balancing like real life references, and then also how we wanted to stylize it. We also did go through a lot of different like variations of what our goal was. Initially, it was supposed to be kind of like wood carving, and I would say at this point it's not really wood carving anymore. So it was pretty organic. But yeah, it just kind of is case by case. That's like been the most I've done with environments on like a bigger scale. Typically, I am more like character focused, which yeah, you are right. I kind of didn't really do much about environments, but that is it's its own can of worms.
Kind of the same thing. We just made it up as.
Yeah. No, definitely. We definitely could have benefited from a little more, like a clear idea, but it can just be kind of tough because once you start translating something to 3D, sometimes it just does not look how you wanted it to or how you were going to picture it. And so I think I don't know, I think it's natural enough for things to be sort of just like ad lib, but it is kind of nice when you do have like a solid vision. So, yeah. Thank you guys for coming. Hopefully that was, again, coherent. Oh, sorry, I see one. Okay. Do a meeting on making models with games in mind versus one with animation. Well, okay, so it says, do you plan on doing a meeting on making models with games in mind versus one with animations? I will say, as just a comment to that, if you are interested in doing models for games, Professor Parrish has like 3 classes on that, at least. The first class, you don't actually get to make it game ready, but the second class you do. I know that's kind of a lot to ask you to take 2 whole classes to get there. But I'd say trying to simplify it as much as I can. Spark Notes with games, you're just going to be more worried about making sure everything works really well and is kind of as optimized as it can be. And so even in his classes, he'll recommend we go a little bit beyond as simple as you would want to go for a game, because he wants them to look good for our portfolio. But yeah, with games, it just comes down to... Oh, you have taken 333? Oh, okay. Then yeah, wait, 333, that's the first one where you don't optimize. So yeah, I'd say just, if you can, just like look around on the internet and try and find like some game models and just practice like making things that wouldn't blow up a computer. But yeah, and like things like, oh, Cassie knows like hair cards, like, because I mean, obviously most game characters can't like function if you have every character has like a full head of actual hair. So just learning to use like the like shorthands for things like hair cards, yeah, rather than like simulations.
I'll say too, for games versus animations. In games,
Oh, do you want to get
using-
closer to the speaker?
Yes. I don't know. For games, you're looking at a lot of like looping animations and things that are going to happen many, many times because the player has agency, and that agency will bring them to do things over and over again or fail and have to see things again. Versus in animation, you're doing things with a script. So you can know ahead of time exactly what parts of the model needs to be able to do what and when. So it's kind of a little bit more generalized for game versus you can be way more specified and intent focused with animation. That's my spiel.
But yeah, hopefully that helped. But yeah, I will say though, if there is a meeting on it, it won't be me because I am about to be out of here. So yeah, yay, last meeting. Kind of. Well, there's the next one, kind of, but yay. Same with Cassian. Everybody also. But yeah. So shout out to anyone else who's graduating. Let's get out of here.
We should all come to the last contest and wish us good luck.
Yes, everybody come to the last contest next week.
Next week.
Be here, win stuff, get free things. That's what got me to first come to this club.
That's all we got, right?
But yeah, cool. All right, then I'll at least wrap up the recording. You guys can hang around or ask any more questions.